Oh, good morning, folks. We are back again. It is Friday morning, so we're doing another Realty reality show episode I do each and every week on the YouTube and Facebook. If I don't freeze. I'm here, joined live this week by Ed Kaiser. He is the managing broker at the 50th and France office. He's also a lawyer, so he is here to talk to us today about today's topic, which is seller property disclosures. You want to sell your house? Well, you don't want to get in trouble doing that by not telling a potential buyer what you know about that house. Ed can actually maybe talk to the legality of all this because he's a lawyer. Ed, thank you for being here.
Good morning. Yes, I can, but I got to say, quick disclaimer that, by having this conversation with you, Chad, we're not creating an attorney-client privilege. And this is not legal advice. This is just a general chat. Attorney disclaimer over. Let's have some fun.
Attorney disclaimer over. And Ed, you are not only a lawyer and a managing broker, you are a homeowner yourself.
Indeed, I am. Yes, I own my own home. Yep, I'm an adult.
And then, Ed, when you go to sell your home, you know things about that home that a potential buyer may want to find out. And that's why you have to disclose those things. And Ed, some of the things we have to disclose, we're not proud of our house or it has some problems. So We want to talk about what we can and cannot do, or what we should and shouldn't do, I should say, when disclosing knowledge to future buyers. Because in Minnesota, the law, it's a statute. The law requires that the seller must disclose all material facts known by a seller that could potentially adversely and significantly affect either an ordinary buyer, is their enjoyment, or their intended use of a property. That's something the seller needs to tell everything that they know about Minnesota law, the disclosures. What's up with this, Ed? The law.
Yeah, so we Minnesota, like probably a majority. I don't think I've done the research about how many other states, but probably almost all of them, if not all of them. It's not a buyer beware type of legal arrangement when it comes to selling real estate. Most states do have some disclosure that's a law that's similar to this, which is that when you're selling real estate, you have to disclose all material facts that affect an ordinary buyer's use and enjoyment of the property, or a specific intended use by a particular buyer for that property. So if you know what a quote unquote material fact is about the home, you need to disclose it. What constitute material facts is, there's a many examples. Generally things that an easy way to think about it is if you were buying your house again. So if I was selling my house, but if I was the buyer, what are the things that I would want to know about that house? And if you say, well, you know what, I would have liked to know that when I bought it. Or if also you say, man, I really don't want to tell buyers about this particular issue with the home because I feel like it's going to scare them away, then that's pretty much a guarantee that that's a material fact. So, it's kind of one of those things where disclose what you know and comply with the law, because otherwise there could be consequences, which I'm sure we'll talk about.
So there's two types of disclosures, or there's a few types of disclosures, but there's the main ones is you can disclose things. As a seller property disclosure, you can add that into your listing, or you could do it as is on a waiver. We could talk about both of those things. Why would you do one or the other?
Yeah, so it is, the statute says that a seller must disclose all material facts, right? But the statute the legislature understood that there could be situations where the parties may not want to disclose or something like that. So there is an option, and it's called the waiver of disclosure. And we have a form as realtors. We have the disclosure statement form, and then we have the disclosure alternatives form, where the waiver option is there. And the waiver is a situation where the buyer and the seller agree in that document in writing that says, we, the buyers, understand that the sellers have an obligation to disclose, but we are agreeing that they do not have to. And that we are agreeing to buy the property without that disclosure. And in so doing, we can't go after the seller after closing for not disclosing something, because we understand that we're allowing the seller to not follow this particular law. Situations where that can be common. A lot of times we saw it a lot way back when I first got into the business with foreclosures. Banks will almost always, if not always, sell on that with a waiver, because they're saying, look, we just acquired this property through foreclosure. We've never been in the property before. We don't know anything about it. We're a bank and we're going to cover ourselves. So we are not going to provide a seller's disclosure. We're going to use the waiver. Other situations maybe that are, since we're not seeing that foreclosures in Minnesota all that often right now, but if it was an estate, if the estate of a deceased person is selling a home, often it might be a situation where you'd say, the kids, let's just say, or even like a trustee or something like that is selling the property, and like, we don't know the extent of many things about this home because we never actually lived in it, or maybe the kids lived in the house 20 years ago when they were kids, but time has passed. And so there are situations where it is relatively normal where the buyers understand why the sellers are agreeing to sell, or why the sellers are selling with the waiver, and they accept that as a premise for it is what it is. If you want to buy this property, you have to accept that. There's other situations too, but I mean, those are kind of some of the more common situations where we see waivers.
Okay, well, the fun thing about this pod this morning is that we're going to talk about specific examples that may apply to people at home that are about to sell their homes. Let's go through those specific examples, and maybe you could talk to me about what a seller should do in those situations. For example,
All right.
Now, I recently had a seller tell me that there was a few mice in a house, and they had the Orkin people out, and they looked for entry points. They sealed the entry points. They put some traps out. They caught a few mice, but they haven't seen any for a few months. Do they have to disclose that? Is that an infestation?
Yeah. So the question about the infestation, right? That word comes in our seller disclosure form, which is a form that was created by the Association of Realtors to help clients fulfill their duty to disclose on material facts. With a lot of these things, and I'm sure all these questions you're going to talk about, my lawyer answer is going to kind of say it depends, right? And so there's going to be, it's a sliding scale of a lot of this stuff. It would be one thing if you said, and because this happened to me in a house, the last house I owned, one time we left the screen door open and a squirrel ran inside, right? Squirrel ran inside, it was running around. We got the brooms out, we shoot it out the door, and the squirrel went away. I don't think anybody would say that was a pest infestation. Was a pest in my home? Sure it was, but it wasn't staying there. If you're a property owner and you had mice, and you probably had mice because you either saw the mice or you saw the droppings, and you had to clean those things up, and you had to trap them, and you had to remove the carcasses, or maybe you were a good steward of the earth and you removed the live mice and you go set them free somewhere else. The reality is they were living there, and I think if you were a homeowner, you say I will, you can disclose, yes, we had mice and we had Orkin come out and we fixed the problem. They came out, they killed them all, they got rid of them all, and now the problem is fixed. The smartest thing I could tell you is you disclose the issue, and then you disclose what you did to correct it. And even, most, if not all sellers, but certainly most will accept, okay, yes, things happen when you own a house. What we want to know is that if you had this problem, what you did to correct it. Because there's always a chance that maybe they missed a mouse, right? Maybe there's still one scurrying around in there. And if you, as a property owner, didn't disclose that you had mice, here's a situation that this has come up more than once, I can tell you, is that the buyers buy the property, they discover evidence that mice are there, they call Orkin, and then Orkin comes up and says, hey, I've been here before.
Oh yeah, this is that
And
house, the
that
mouse house.
will get you in trouble because suddenly
Sure.
and it would be, you would get in trouble if, as a property owner, if you failed to mention the mice whatsoever. If you disclose, yes, we had some mice, we had the treatment, we believe it's all taken care of, and then it turns out maybe, because mice are living beings, maybe the mice were all gone, and then a mouse comes back the next winter, right? It's a different infestation. That infestation was fixed, and then a new mouse comes in, a new mouse family. If Orchid comes back and says, actually, we have been here before, you as the seller, you disclose what you knew, you disclose what happened, and then if you've done that, you protect yourself from liability as long as you disclose the truth of the matter. But if you say nothing, that's where things can literally come back to bite you.
Okay.
Not literally, probably, whatever the opposite is.
Now, what about our neighbor that we have that always fixes his car and he plays loud, heavy metal music when he does it, and it's just obnoxious?
So is it almost always a neighbor doing their thing, living their best life on their property? Is if they're doing that on their property, it's probably difficult to say that whatever they're doing has a material impact on your use and enjoyment of the property. Okay. If the neighbor is a nudist, right, and just hanging out over there, having fun, but it's like the only way that you would know that is if you're peering over the fence and looking at him. It's like that's what's happening on his side of the property. What really matters is what is happening really within your four corners of the property. Now, if the neighbor was an amateur, I don't know, or running like an unofficial, unlicensed business or something like that in their property, where he's generating tons of smoke as he's like creating some sort of product, I don't know, right? But if that smoke was then carrying on your property, that'd be a little bit different story. If something like, yeah, I mean, it probably gets in. It depends, right? But ultimately, if people are just doing normal stuff, that's accepted. If you have neighbors, they're going to live there, right? So there's a sliding scale there where it's like if it really has to have a material impact on how you live and enjoy that property. And my guess is most of the time, just a neighbor, working on cars, that doesn't affect how you enjoy your life, because the reality is you're not buying a house on the moon by yourself, right? You're buying a house in the neighborhood, and that's right. There's going to be an element of shared community there.
Now, so my house has quirks. Almost every house has quirks. Do you have to disclose all of the little quirks? Like, for example, my house is kind of weird. It's a little bit older. It's got this furnace that I need to adjust this one dial here this way and make sure this vent is closed over here. Do I have to tell everybody about these quirks that I've learned over the last few years of living there?
Depends, I guess, what you mean by quirks, right? Just because if there's things that you've learned, like how to maximize the efficiency of your like your heating or something like that, those are the things I would just share as a good human being, right? To just pass that information along. But if a stair squeaks, no, I mean that's just part of life. But on the other hand, if what you're saying, if I only have to shut this vent, and if I don't shut this vent and turn it on this way, the furnace will shut off and won't work in the wintertime, then that would be a little bit of a different story, right? Where, again, it gets down to what an ordinary buyer use and enjoyment, and if the core mechanicals, like if you can't, I don't know, like I say, if every time you ring the doorbell and the microwave's on, then all the power goes out, like those kinds of things, like that's a quirk where people need to know those things, versus just idiosyncrasies of the house that those very well could be up to your preference, right? If you have preferences, those aren't necessarily disclosures.
Now, what if there's something wrong that I know, like my window has this spot that I touch it and it's kind of soft, but I'm not an expert on windows and I don't know enough to know that I need to disclose that? Do I need to disclose that, or do I just let an inspector find these things? And then I shrug and I say, oh shit, I remember that now. I don't know. What's the best way to disclose something that you're not sure? I mean, well, we're going to write a novel in the disclosure if we said every single thing, right? Or should we be doing that?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the one hand, certainly you as a homeowner, you don't need to be an expert in all things relating to your home. But I think we can both agree that we know that wood is generally not supposed to be soft. So if you do know that there's parts of your home, like that the windows are rotted, there is a section in the disclosure that talks about the windows. That would be a time to say, okay, yeah, that's right. There are a couple things about the windows. And really what you could do is call out those items for an inspector to check it up on. But what it's really important is not to just rely on, well, the inspector is going to catch it, because what we're seeing right now in this market is people waiving their right to inspection. And that's important because it's not for in all cases, but in a lot of situations we're seeing buyers waiving their inspections in order to make their offer more appealing. The reality is this: if we as sellers want to rely on a buyer and their inspector to catch some of these items that we just don't want to disclose, and then there's no inspection, and then the deal closes, and then the buyer discovers these issues after closing, guess what? The seller would still be liable. We don't get to point at the fact that the buyers chose not to get an inspection as a defense to the law, which is that we as sellers must disclose. When I say the seller must disclose all material facts that they're aware of. So I would just say, when you're a seller and you're filling out the disclosure, take the time. And yeah, it seems like you're going to be writing a novel, but the reality is what you are is filling out the form that realtors provide, and you're checking the box, and then you're just writing little notes in there. More often than not, there's less than you think, but it's important not to take it lightly and just blow it off completely and just say, oh, they'll catch those things, right? It is always better to over disclose than under disclose, because you don't want to deal with a post-closing lawsuit.
Okay. Now, I have this example. This is going to be fun, maybe talk through. A seller accepts an offer. A buyer does an inspection. The buyer finds there's wood rot. The roof is bad. All of these little issues that they go back to the seller. They present the facts of the findings to the seller. The seller's aware of these things. The seller does not agree to do anything. The deal is canceled. My buyer walks or whatever. The house gets put back on the market, and the seller does not disclose any of this new finding. And my buyer's kind of annoyed that, somehow the seller can put the house back on the market without telling them what we've just told them, telling the market that. So is this something that a seller doesn't have to say, even though we've just told them this thing? This is kind of a difficult situation for sellers, because it says, we have to rely on a buyer's inspection, and then we have to take that as material fact when we've been living there and there is no water damage, or we don't believe there is, or whatever the case is. What happens when it gets canceled and then put back on and nothing's changed?
Yeah, so that's one of those things where it can happen, where a seller, they lived there for many years, they had no issues with it. Like take radon, for example, right? Radon has become it becomes a mandatory disclosure now. People are often getting their homes tested for radon. But people who grew up older than we are, lived their entire lives unaware that radon was even a thing, or that it was in Minnesota homes, right? So like sellers were putting their homes on the market since the sort of the discovery of radon in Minnesota basements, things like that. And all of a sudden, inspectors were saying, you have high levels of radon in your home. You need to basically either install some sort of mitigation system, or you need to disclose to future buyers that there's high levels of radon in this basement. And so suddenly, whether that's an example or anything else, mold, bad roof, whatever, that is a thing that happens with sellers, where an inspector comes in and says, unfortunately, this is a reality. You have a problem with your home, and the law, the disclosure law will apply to that seller if then their deal that they're currently under contract with cancels and they go back on the market. They have to disclose it. They can't pretend like that never happened, because they now are aware of that information. And even if, let's say the seller didn't want to disclose it, even if they just put, no, absolutely not. That's ridiculous. I refuse to disclose it. We as the agents now, the listing agent, we have the same disclosure obligation that the clients do built into our law. So it's like, if they're not going to disclose it, we're going to have to disclose it for them. either way, we have to take care of that disclosure. What I would say maybe to clients is that we often, as an industry, we put disclosures and things like that on the MLS in the supplements and stuff like that. Sometimes agents will choose not to. We don't have to put that on the MLS necessarily. Sometimes agents will, with like certain sensitive information or some stuff that requires some context, agents will choose how they provide that information to an interested buyer. You don't have to necessarily put it on the MLS. Some people just go old school and they just leave the disclosure on the table at the house, and that's just the way. There's different ways to skin that cat. But so sometimes when our client who walked away from the deal is looking back and saying, well, where's that disclosure? 99 times out of 100, it's going to be made, but it may just be, it may be just being handled delicately or sort of on a case-by-case basis. Because here's the reality: if a buyer buys this house, the house that your clients walked away from, and then they discover this issue, the MLS keeps track of these records. And if they discover an issue and they look back, they can see in the MLS that was under contract with your buyer. And guess what? If they're in a lawsuit, they're going to call you, Chad, and be like, hey, would you be a witness in my trial? Can you tell me why you were under contract with this property and then the deal canceled? And you'll be like, of course I can. Here, let me tell you all about it. And so suddenly, trying to be cute and pretend like, I see nothing, I hear nothing, that disclosure, that doesn't exist. You kind of can't run away from it because you're leaving breadcrumbs of evidence of this disclosure. And really, it's usually more emotional and just frustrating for sellers because suddenly what they thought they were going to get for their home may not be the case. And they want to blame the inspector, they want to blame somebody else. But the reality is, maybe it was deferred maintenance. Maybe it just was an issue that just happened, right? But at the end of the day, it's part and parcel of trying to sell real estate. Sometimes these things happen and you just have to deal with it as the homeowner. And more often than not, the reality is you just have to disclose it and move on. Fortunately, in this market, probably not going to be that much of an issue. You probably can still find a buyer because there's a lot of buyers out there right now.
Okay, Ed, what about when a family member dies in the home? Now, they just fell asleep one night and didn't wake up the next day. They died peacefully in their sleep. Do we have to disclose that?
No. So there are a few. The legislature of Minnesota has come up with some exceptions, exclusions to the seller disclosure law. They've listed out a few things in that chapter where they say these things you do not have to disclose. And one of those exclusions are the death either by an accident, natural death, or even suicide. They've just said, we're not going to make that part of a burden for disclosure. Perhaps it's relating to the emotional element already of the home. I think it also maybe reflects a reality that these things do happen. Another interesting exclusion from the statute that the Minnesota legislature, they actually must have debated this issue, but they wrote a law and passed it, is that sellers do not have to disclose whether the home is haunted or has a presence of ghosts, because they explicitly said we're not going to even go there. We're not going to let consumers or people argue or debate whether or not ghosts exist, and if so, if this house is haunted, because that would be impossible to prove. So they just said that is, and that's one of the reasons why people get weirded out about a death in the home, is that some people think that the home is haunted, but they've just said, look, that is a natural part of life. That can happen in a home. And we're just going to basically take that off the plate of any potential litigation if there's a death, either accidental or even suicide. That is not a disclosure, nor is the fact that the home is occupied by any paranormal demons. Yeah. But there is an exception. I'm pretty sure from your notes, you're going to ask me about murder.
Yeah, and I mean, now, how often are people getting murdered in houses? Probably not that often, but you do want to disclose a murder because we know, Ed, the neighbor's going to welcome you into the house and say, hey, here's my Jello mold. I'm so glad someone bought the murder house.
Yeah.
You're going to find out by the neighbor in 2 seconds.
So that's actually, well, and that's it. But they actually, the legislature, they cut, when they made that rule, they said you do not have to disclose a natural death, an accidental death, or a suicide. They did not say murder. And so the way they crafted the law is that if you are aware that a murder occurred on the property, then you must disclose that. Now, when you're talking to neighbors, the reality is whether it was a natural death or murder, yes, probably chances are the neighbors are gonna be like, well, you bought that house, right? And so sometimes people will just, for the sake of addressing it head on, even though they're not required, they will just disclose it anyway, that a person died in the home. And sometimes it'll be, that's why it's for sale. That's why we're selling on a waiver, because this person died in the home. But ultimately, murder will always need to be disclosed. If a murder occurred in the home, much, much, much less common, frankly. But that's a distinction. And if you want to get really morbid, what I would say, and I've had my time in legal, I had these conversations. If the person died in the home, whether by murder or by accident, but as a result, they needed to do some repairs, professional cleaning, sanding out the floorboards to eliminate staining, that needs to be disclosed, because those are physical defects, whether they're caused by a natural death or otherwise. The physical impact or result of the decomposition, it needs to be disclosed. Super rare, probably not going to happen. But I mean, these are some of these situations where the exception to the law overlaps with some of the spirit of the law and the obligation to disclose about the condition. It's really about the physical condition of the property.
Okay. I think we've covered most of the stuff here. To summarize, the best policy is honesty. Isn't it always, Ed?
Oh, yes, I think so. I think making sure, here's what I'd say, is that there's always the temptation and there's always the fear from a seller that says, well, I'm worried that if I disclose that, I'm not going to get top dollar for my home. I worry that if I disclose that, I'm not going to be able to sell my home. In both of those answers, I would, especially the second one, I'd say in a market like this, or any market truly, the best policy is to disclose, to allow the buyers an opportunity to either consider that disclosure, to maybe investigate it, have it inspected, to really understand the potential cost of it, and to hopefully, if there's an issue, negotiate some sort of financial concession or agreement. How do you articulate, like this? Like, we keep coming back to the morbid example, but okay, somebody died in the home. How much is that worth to you? $5,000, $10,000. Like, how do you quantify that? There are some people who just won't care. There are other people, whether it's culturally or personally, really care, and it's a non-starter. But it's hard. But here's the thing. But let's take that example off the table. But let's say the pet infestation or something like that, where there's a $10,000. Ultimately, after closing, we discover there's a major infestation. There's a $10,000 bill that we have to pay the exterminator. Yikes, right? If the parties are negotiating upfront and they say, yeah, we had a pest infestation, we took care of it as far as we knew, we had Orkin come out, and then the buyer says, okay, how about we agree to a $2,000 price reduction just because I'm not quite comfortable. The parties negotiate, they agree to that number, fine. Parties move on, they close. If you can negotiate it upfront, you would just at least take care of the issue. The problem is, if you don't disclose anything and then after closing there's a lawsuit, it's not a defense to tell the judge or the arbitrator, well, I didn't know that you were going to sue me for that much money. I guess I would have totally negotiated. We would have found the solution more, middle ground. It doesn't work that way. The arbitrator will just say, you didn't disclose. There's $10,000 in damages. You pay $10,000. I mean, so like that. At the end of the day, the thing that drives people not to disclose, which is the fear of taking a financial hit, is ultimately the worst if they choose not to disclose something and then they get sued and lose after closing. The best solution is to address it up front, to work out a solution, negotiate. That's what you, realtor, Chad is here for, to do that, to help to put some context and try to help articulate a cost and negotiate a solution to these kind of difficult issues. But that's why you hire a realtor, to help you with those things, so you don't have to hire an attorney to defend you after the fact. Because guess what? The attorneys bill you hourly, realtors don't.
And Ed, you can find me working out of the 50th in France office in Edina, Minnesota, and my number is scrolling across the bottom, and you can email me, text me, call me, all those things. I will be back each and every Friday morning live on the internet doing my thing on the Realty show. Thanks for joining me, Ed. I appreciate your insight and being a lawyer, and it's very helpful. Like and subscribe, share this around. Let's make sure that the sellers out there are disclosing things properly so that we're not buying a bad house.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Ed, where do we
Thanks.
find you? You're on Instagram doing things. You got exceptional property videos on there. That's kind of cool.
I got my content. Instagram handle at Ed from Edina. At Ed from Edina. I'm Ed. I'm from Edina. So
there you go.
There you go.
All right, Ed. Thanks for joining me. Appreciate you.
Thanks, man.
Let's play this music and get out of here. All right. Till next time. See you later.